Now I'm going to read Dr. Edward Edinger's commentary found in the Aion lectures, Exploring the Self in C.G. Jung's Aion. And this explicitly is the commentary on the first 5 paragraphs of chapter 5 of Aion. Christ, a symbol of the self. Chapter 5 of Aion deals with the expression of the self in the Christian myth, the prevailing myth of Western civilization. The rest of the book is about various aspects of the self, deeper and more profound ones, and as we go deeper, the viewpoint broadens out until it reaches a kind of infinite extent. Early in this chapter, in paragraph 70, Jung makes a revolutionary statement which amounts to the announcement of a whole new worldview. The statement is, Christ exemplifies the archetype of the self. That is a simple sentence, but it is a blockbuster once it is understood in its full reality, not just as an intellectual token. It is the first clear announcement that Western man's experience of the self has shifted from religious projection into the human psyche, and that man, at least one man, Jung, is conscious of that fact. Human consciousness has discovered the religion-creating archetype, of which the figure of Christ is just one expression, though the relevant one for our particular culture. We can now see what is prior to or behind the metaphysical projection, which is personified by Christ. What is prior to it is what goes by the name of the self. Let us consider some of the evidence that Christ exemplifies the archetype of the self. The characteristics that gathered around the Christ image correspond in many respects to the phenomenology of the self as it is observed empirically. For example, Christ is identified as the central source in such phrases as, I am the vine, you are the branches, John 15:5. This is a symbolic feature of the self. Christ is also described as a union of opposites. He says, I am Alpha and Omega, Revelation 1:8. The symbolism of 4 and 12, commonly occurring in association with the self, is also associated with Christ, who is surrounded by the disciples corresponding to the 12 signs of the zodiac. There is the fourfold symbolism of the cross, and the image of Christ as the center of Christian mandalas, surrounded by symbols of the 4 evangelists. Various images symbolizing the kingdom of heaven are practically identical with the image of Christ, such as the pearl of great price, or the treasure buried in the field, or the mustard seed that grows to be the great tree, or the heavenly city. Jung goes into the analogies between the Christ figure and the phenomenology of the self in more detail in his essay, A Psychological Approach to the Dogma of the Trinity. Quote, the most important of the symbolical statements about Christ are those which review the attributes of the hero's life: improbable origin, divine father, hazardous birth, rescue in the nick of time, precocious development, conquest of the mother and of death, miraculous deeds, a tragic early end, post-mortem effects, reappearances, signs and marvels, etc. Christ is himself God, an all-embracing totality, representation of the Rex Gloriae in a mandala. He symbolizes the integration of the kings and prophets of the Old Testament. His body is bread to be eaten, and his blood wine to be drunk. These mythological statements, coming from within the Christian sphere as well as from outside it, adumbrate an archetype that expresses itself in essentially the same symbolism and also occurs in individual dreams or in fantasy-like projections upon living people. The content of all such symbolic products is the idea of an overpowering, all-embracing, complete or perfect being, represented either by a man of heroic proportions, or by an animal with magical attributes, or by a magical vessel, or geometrically by a mandala. This archetypal idea is a reflection of the individual's wholeness, i.e., of the self, which is present in him as an unconscious image. It was this archetype of the self in the soul of every man that responded to the Christian message. Jung is talking about the beginning of the Christian era, with the result that the concrete Rabbi Jesus was rapidly assimilated by the constellated archetype. This is why we know practically nothing about the historical Jesus. He was hidden behind projections of the self. The archetype of the self can also be spoken of as the image of God in the human psyche, the Imago Dei. With certain ideas such as this, it is helpful to follow Jung and use the Latin terminology. This emphasizes that we are dealing with a technical term in Jungian psychology and fixes it in the mind by baptizing the term in Latin, so to speak. Jung writes about Christ as being equated with the Imago Dei, psychologically speaking, with the self. He quotes several texts related to Christ as the Imago Dei, starting with the first chapter of Genesis. God says, quote, "Let us make man in our own image," unquote. Genesis 1:26. This passage at the beginning of the Bible establishes that man contains an Imago Dei, and this basic mythological fact has undergone immense reflection, theological scrutiny, and elaboration. It is this original Imago Dei which is considered to have been damaged by the fall of man. Jung refers to this idea here in paragraph 72. Quote, "The God image in man was not destroyed by the fall, but was only damaged and corrupted, deformed, and can be restored through God's grace." Jung is describing the mythological understanding and speaking in terms of the Christian myth. The scope of the integration is suggested by the descensus ad inferos, the descent of Christ's soul to hell, its work of redemption embracing even the dead. The psychological equivalent of this is the integration of the collective unconscious, which forms an essential part of the individuation process. Jung assumes that his readers are thoroughly familiar with this reference, though it is not even a biblical reference. It is legendary. According to the legends, which became quite widespread in the pictorial material of the Middle Ages, between the time of Christ's death on the cross and his resurrection, he descended into hell, or more specifically, into limbo. He broke the brass gates of hell and rescued the ancient worthies, leading them back to the upper realm. Jung refers to this image as symbolizing the integration of the collective unconscious. In other words, one aspect of individuation involves the descent to hell and the rescuing of the lost worthies, their redemption and restoration to consciousness.